In early 1983, in a neighborhood called Muswell Hills in London, several plumbing complaints were made by the tenants of a house named Cranley Gardens. When the drain was opened to determine the cause of the blockade, the plumber discovered a flesh-like substance and a bunch of small bones of unidentified origin. These remains were examined at a mortuary in the next days, and it turned out they were human, and even worse, they belonged to someone who had been strangled to death. The police were called to the scene, and upon arrival, it didn't take long for them to realize that the source of these remains was the top floor of the building, a flat occupied by a man called Dennis Nilsen. They rushed to his door immediately, but he wasn't home. This left the detectives no choice but to wait for him outside the building. Once he returned, the man was extremely polite and allowed them into his home without any kind of resistance. As soon as they entered the apartment, the unmistakable stench of a human body struck the nose of the agents, who said, "Don't mess about, where's the rest of the body?" Nilsen pointed to the wardrobe in his bedroom. Immediately after, in a very calm and almost nonchalant way, he told them, "It's a long story. It goes back a long time. I'll tell you everything. I want to get it off my chest. Not here, at the police station." Once in the police car, and on the way to the station, one of the officers couldn't help himself and asked, "How many bodies are we talking about? 1 or 2? Nilsen made a pause as he stared into the window. 15 or 16, he said. Today's video is about Dennis Nilsen, quintessential necrophile and serial killer. Nilsen was born in November 23, 1945, in Scotland. As the product of a marriage with an absent father, he naturally developed a quiet and shy personality, but still, he was considered a normal kid. When his parents divorced, he went to live to his grandparents' house. Nilsen loved his grandfather especially, who gave him the attention and affection he desperately craved from a father figure. According to him, the best moments of his life were when his grandfather took him on long walks on the beach, where atop his shoulders he could fully observe the coast and the neighboring towns. Nilsen said that when his grandfather left home for work, he felt completely empty and disconnected from the rest of his family. His relationship with his grandfather was the only thing in his life that made him happy. But of course, time stops for no one. And said grandfather died of a heart attack when Nilsen was only 6 years old. At the funeral, which was an open casket ceremony, his mother carried him to see the body of his dear grandfather. When little Nilsen approached the coffin, something inside him broke. The image of his idol lay in a state which he perceived as being of complete peace would be one that remained with him for the rest of his life. His grandfather's love and the sight of his corpse cemented a deep association in his brain between love and bodies. Nothing of importance happened after that until the year 1961, when, all grown up, he enlisted in the army, where he was kicked out from due to erratic and bizarre behavior. Then, he became a cop, but got fired for the same reasons. He finally got a stable employment at a job center. Stephen Holmes. On an unfortunate day, Nilsen, unable to stand his own thoughts, began drinking heavily while he listened to music and did all he could to distract himself. But this didn't last. After one last glass of rum, something took a hold of him. A force that compelled him to get out of his home and find company at that very moment. He went straight to a bar where he found a young boy called Stephen Holmes, who was angry because they wouldn't sell him alcohol due to him being a minor. Nilsen, who knew how to be charismatic, approached him and offered him to go back to his place to have some drinks. Of course, the boy accepted. They drank all night and listened to music until they went to bed, almost passed out. The next morning, Nilsen woke up first, noting that the boy was sleeping beside him. He felt happy for a moment, but then he started experiencing an overwhelming dread. If he woke the boy up, he would get dressed and leave, and would probably never spend the night with him again. He started wavering his options, but he could feel the clock ticking. The following phrase appeared on his mind: "He's gonna stay with me over the new year whether he wants to or not." In a moment of frenzy, he grabbed the tie and strangled the teen until he was unconscious. Then he drowned him in a bucket of water. Nilsen felt complete peace, the same one he felt during his walks with his grandfather. Afterwards, he turned on the shower and started to wash the body meticulously. He then dried and dressed it and began to watch TV next to it, while he drank rum and made jokes. Once the corpse started to decompose, he had no choice but to bury it underneath the floorboards of his kitchen. And of course, find a replacement. The boy was only 14 years old. Martin Duffy. Duffy was a 16-year-old teenager who had run away from his parents' house. He hitchhiked with the objective of arriving in London, where he was planning to get a job and become independent. Unfortunately, this now meant that he was in a crime-ridden city, completely alone and without a dime to his name. The boy, defeated, had no choice but to start sleeping on a park's bench, not knowing what would become of him. After 4 days of living like this, he finally attracted Nilsen's attention, who, before approaching him, constructed the most helpful and less threatening personality he could. He offered him a meal and a place to stay the night. Charismatic as always, Duffy accepted his invitation, believing him to be a kind man that had taken pity of him. They ate together, and it didn't take long for Nilsen to convince him of having a few drinks with him. They eventually drank in excess, and the boy had to lay down in the bed, completely out of it. It was at this moment that Nilsen pounced on him. He jumped and landed on his stomach and started strangling him with a shoelace. Once unconscious, he was drowned in the kitchen sink. Afterwards, Nilsen washed his body, dressed it, and spent weeks fondling him, watching TV and telling it that he loved him, among other things. Eventually, he ended up buried in the same place as Holmes' body, under the floorboards of the kitchen. Malcolm Barlow. In the middle of a particularly chilly night, Nilsen encountered a man leaning over a wall near his house. He seemed to be under excruciating pain. Nilsen asked the man if he was okay and what was the problem, and the man explained that his epilepsy meds were causing him adverse effects. Nilsen, acting extremely worried, told him that he should be in a hospital. He helped the man to his house and called for an ambulance, staying with him until it arrived. The young man went to the hospital, and that was the end of that night. That boy could have easily carried on with his life. Without knowing, he was lucky enough to be one of the few people that survived the night with Nilsen. Sadly though, this young man was a person of honor, so he didn't hesitate to come back to Nilsen's house to thank him for what he had done for him. Nilsen, jovial and hospitable, invited him to have lunch, an offer that the boy accepted. That was the last that was heard of him. Since 1978 until 1983, Nilsen started killing much more frequently. It reached the point of becoming a ritual of sorts. First, he would drift about the streets, looking for a homeless person or anyone in need. He would offer them a meal or alcohol to lure them towards his place. Second, he would press his companion into drinking until near unconsciousness, and then he would strangle them and subsequently drown them. But murder wasn't the important part. No, for him, the real fun began afterwards. He would wash the body, dress it, and live with it. He would caress it, worship it, and engage in all kinds of sexual activities with it, as well as having long conversations while watching TV. When the body started to decompose and he could no longer bear the smell, they would be buried in his kitchen's floorboards, and the cycle would begin anew. The number of corpses grew to a point in which he could no longer hide the smell from his neighbors, so he burned them all in a fire along with a rubber tire to disguise the stench. Nilsen remembered that a group of small children approached the grotesque bonfire without knowing what it was made of. Nilsen fantasized that the children danced in circles around the flames. Nilsen hated every person he met. He was perceived as an apathetic loner. His grandfather was the only thing in his life that made him feel complete, and the peace he felt when he saw his body was something that he had never felt before, and something he was desperate to feel again. While his relationships and other aspects of his life were falling apart, his necrophiliac fantasies started to increase exponentially. Nilsen had a tough time connecting with people, and the few times he ever got in a relationship, they would end abruptly, which led him to develop a deep, overwhelming, and almost monstrous fear of abandonment. Eventually, he had a realization. He would never be loved. It didn't matter what he tried. People would always abandon him, just like his grandfather did. Even as a kid, his mind had always been a cesspool of deviancy. His obsession with cadavers, the arousal he felt whenever he thought about them, and the piercing resentment he felt towards the world. He let all of it take over and abandoned everything else as a result of this realization. Since life had lost all meaning to him, he sought it in death. For him, an ideal relationship could never be with someone that was alive. It could only be achieved with a corpse that would never leave, one who could give him peace, the same kind he felt when he first saw the body of his grandfather. Nilsen had to move to an apartment and, lacking in places in which he could hide bodies, he started cutting them into pieces and throwing them down the drain. These remains, like I've told you before, were discovered, and that led to the situation I talked about at the start of the video. Nilsen confessed to all of his crimes, with excruciating detail from the very beginning. Excited by all the attention, he began giving long interviews to the detectives and even befriended a writer who wanted to make a book about him. He let the police know that he would plead guilty, that he felt remorse for his crimes, but at the very last minute, he changed his plea. He claimed he was insane and therefore technically not guilty of his crimes, due to not being in his senses when he committed them, the oldest trick in the book for serial killers that are caught. This would mean that instead of being sent to prison, he would go to a mental hospital, where security is lax, but worse than that, this meant that there was a possibility for him to eventually be released by convincing the doctors that he was cured and no longer a threat to society. He'd be out in the streets again, and the bodies of innocent boys would keep on piling underneath him. His trial was long and complex. Nobody that had previously been abused by Nilsen and survived wanted to testify. They did not want to face the raging homophobia that was rampant in the UK at the time. But thankfully, Carl Stotter, a man that's nothing short of a hero, decided he would rather face the hatred and the insults than allow Nilsen to kill again. Stotter managed to escape Nilsen's house after being strangled with a plastic bag, which obviously caused him PTSD. But he faced this condition at the verge of tears, while he looked at Nilsen straight in the eyes and said the words that would eventually imprison him. Nilsen was initially sentenced to 28 years to life at first, but it was eventually changed to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, what's referred in the UK as a whole life tariff. He's dead now. His ashes scattered in a place of no significance. Only 2 people came to the cremation ceremony, and one of them was a security guard. This vile and execrable man took the lives of 12 confirmed victims. Several bodies remain unidentified.